Explain like I'm 5. What does the phrase "you can't prove a negative" actually mean? Others have explained the idea behind the phrase. But this phrase is or should be used when another party is placing an undue burden of proof as an argument for or against something. The unwary will fall into the trap of trying to prove this, while the savvier will retort with "you cannot prove a negative." The reason, as others have pointed out, is straightforward. Proof of existence has to demonstrate one occurrence to satisfy the proof. Proof of non-existence requires evidence that under every possible scenario, such an event cannot exist. These are wildly asymmetrical efforts. If I claim that purple unicorns exist, and you were to say they don't because nobody has ever seen them, I can reply nobody has seen them yet, or people were not looking in the right places, etc. There's a double-decker bus buried somewhere on the moon. I don't believe that's true. Prove to me there isn't, then I bet you can't. The general idea is that you can't provide evidence for something not existing unless you limit the properties of the existence. For example, I can't prove that there isn't a random brown cow on the planet that gives chocolate milk, since even if I milk all the cows, you can always just say I missed the cow that does it. On the other hand, if you point to a specific brown cow and say that brown cow always gives chocolate milk instead of milk, then I can just prove it doesn't by milking it. Similarly, you can't prove a species is extinct or God doesn't exist or ghosts don't exist and so on. It means you can't prove that something doesn't exist. To prove that, you'd have to have perfect knowledge of all things, which is impossible. You can definitely make very convincing circumstantial arguments that something doesn't exist. Imagine you order something online and it doesn't arrive. So you send a complaint to the site and they ask you for a photo as proof. What would the proof even be? Nothing. Because you can't really prove a negative. The only way to prove a negative is to prove a positive that directly contradicts it. You can prove that this mug isn't green by proving the positive that it is in fact red. Basically, it's harder to prove that something doesn't exist, because the evidence that it doesn't exist. You would instead have to show every possible scenario where it could possibly exist and show that it isn't there. It's like the devil's proof. You can't prove that witches or magic or 10 tons of gold doesn't exist somewhere on an island. It means you can't prove something didn't happen. For example, Bob accuses Jane of stealing his cookie. Jane denies it, and Bob tells her to prove that she didn't eat the cookie. She can't prove she didn't. She explains why it's unlikely that she ate the cookie, but not prove it. This can also go for proving something doesn't exist. A very common one is if you're so sure God doesn't exist, then prove it. Well, you can show reasons why it's unlikely God exists, but you can't prove it absolutely. It's a matter of placing burden of proof. You can't prove there is no teapot on orbit around Mars. If I claim there is, how will you prove me wrong? Well, you don't have to. Me claiming such would be ridiculous, and it would be me who would have to be proving things, not you. Until I do, my claims have no merit and can be disregarded as baseless. Same thing if I claim I have an invisible dragon in my living room. You don't have to prove that I don't. It's up to me to prove what I claim to be true is not complete nonsense. To prove something doesn't exist, you need to know everything there possibly is to know about the universe, which is impossible. If I have a warehouse the size of Texas full of white balls and one black ball, you can easily prove that there are white balls in there by opening your eyes. You can't prove there are no black balls unless you know the color of every single ball either, because I told you, or you physically checked all 90 billion balls. Proving a positive requires knowing the positive thing. Proving a negative requires you to know everything. This reminds me of the South Park episode featuring the History Channel. Of all the journals we researched about the early pilgrims, not one entry mentions aliens not being there. Okay, how would you prove that there isn't a teapot in orbit around the moon? Show your work. If I asked you to prove you had blown your nose, you could show me a used tissue video of you blowing your nose. Or someone who saw you blow your nose could tell me that you did. If I asked you to prove you didn't blow your nose, showing me an empty trash can wouldn't prove there weren't used tissues there before. You would need video of every second of your life to show you had never blown it. Or someone would need to have seen your nose at all times to prove you hadn't. Imagine I say you owe me 10 grand. You deny it. I take you to court. The court will demand that I prove you owe me the money. Because it would be ridiculous to demand you to prove that you don't owe me. In order to prove there are no purple unicorns in space, you would have to search all of space simultaneously, which is impossible. You did it, didn't you? When you order something online that doesn't arrive, you get in touch about a refund replacement. They ask you for proof that you didn't receive your package. How are you supposed to prove that? Okay, hold on. Let me just take a picture of nothing. I'll send it right over. Man shrugging. Let's say we're sitting in a restaurant and you get up to go to the bathroom. You're gone for 1 minute. And then you return. When you sit down, I ask you to prove to me that you didn't drop down and do push-ups in there before coming back out. That would be proving a negative. There is no evidence you can provide to me that proves you did not do push-ups in the bathroom. Are there any neon pink polar bears? No. But how can you prove it? You can't prove something can't happen because you would have to try every possible thing. You can prove something can happen because you do the thing to make it happen. It describes information that is unfalsifiable. Good examples of this would be God, Sasquatch, and ETs. Ultimately, you can't prove their non-existence. Because what constitutes evidence something doesn't exist? As Donald Rumsfeld put, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. Coincidentally, we never found evidence of WMDs in Iraq. Can you prove that there isn't a potato orbiting the sun in the Kuiper Belt? It's only applicable in a scientific sense. The concept has to be tangible. The typical phrase "prove Bigfoot doesn't exist" is unprovable. However, intangible concepts can be proven through a negative. Otherwise, no one could argue they didn't commit a crime. Very wordy answers so far. I think the best way to explain it is with an example. Let's say my hypothesis is life does not exist in the universe outside of planet Earth. This is considered a negative hypothesis because, in short, it has the word "not" in it. There's no way to prove this because no matter how many planets and star systems we search that don't contain life, there could always be life at the next one. The quote is a common misconception. The Michelson-Morley experiment proved that there was no luminiferous ether. It's quite easy to prove something exists or something did happen. You can see the pyramids in Egypt. Therefore, you can prove they were built. It's a lot harder to prove something or someone didn't exist or an event didn't happen. Conspiracy theorists saying the moon landings were faked or people saying Jesus didn't exist. For example, as there's not going to be a historical record you can find saying this person wasn't around here. It's a question of formal logic. In logic, we do not prove anything but attempt to disprove it. In other words, all I can reasonably say about gravity is that all attempts at disproving existence of gravity has failed. It might still be true that gravity does not exist. Or it might not exist tomorrow. But so far we have not been able to disprove it.